Our first speaker this evening, my dear colleague and friend, Rabbi Dr. David Shabtai, is the Rav of the Sephardic Minyan here at the Boca Raton Synagogue. He is a medical doctor who has written what is a very popular and important book called Defining the Moment on Brain Death. He's also the author of the forthcoming book on Purim called Hiding in Plain Sight. He's a Rebbe in several of the schools in our community, and it's a great honor and privilege to be able to welcome Rabbi Dr. David Shabtai.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Goldberg. Thank you, Rabbi Simi Shabtai, for putting this all together. I have the privilege of starting us off and giving some of the background. So we're going to be discussing some of the history, the archaeology, the chemistry, what makes Techeiles Techeiles. So we'll start with some of the history, because it's somewhat interesting. This is one of the few mitzvot in the Torah which we, until recently, really haven't had the opportunity to do. It's a mitzvah that seems to have disappeared somewhat. And so it's important to try to figure out when that happened, what happened, when, why, and what has happened recently to change all of that. And so we know that the Torah talks about the mitzvah of Techeiles when it comes to tzitzis, when it comes to Big Day Kehuna. It's an assumption that we know what this is. It's something that's available. It's something that each and every single person was required to have. So it sounds at the very least that Techeiles is something that exists. It's something that's common. It's something that's well known. But it's also something that's unique. It's reserved for the Big Day Kahuna. It's reserved for a certain number of strings on tzitzis. But it doesn't seem to be something that's all that common, but something that certainly exists. We know that when the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, so Yirmiyahu Hanavi writes, that Nebuzaradan left a number of people in Eretz Yisrael. He didn't exile everybody. And the Gemara explains who are these Chormim and Yogvim. Yogvim refer to those who made Techeiles. They were on the coast. They were necessary for the Techeiles production. As we'll see, Techeiles production is not something that can be done everywhere. It has to be done only where Techeiles is found. It comes from a snail. It comes from a sea creature, and so it needs to be found by that sea creature. Eretz Yisrael is on the coast, and it made sense to leave people there who knew what they were doing. It was a skill. It wasn't something that everybody could do. It's something that many, many people wanted. It was a sign of royalty and regality that we'll see. And it made sense to leave them there. So we know that certainly during the time, at the end of the first Beis HaMikdash should exist. During the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, we know that the Big Day Kahuna continued to have Techeiles. And we know that the Gemara in Menachot, many hundreds of years later, talks about the fact that they know how to make Techeiles. It says, Amar le Abayler of Shmuel bar Yehuda, Hatchilta heichi tzav itula. How do you dye Techeiles? And he tells him he has a recipe for how to dye Techeiles, and we'll see some of the details of this as we go on. But at the very least, we see that it was something that was at least known throughout the time of the Gemara. Meaning, even though the Jews had left Eretz Yisrael already, in the time of the Gemara, this at least existed somewhat, that they were aware that this happened, and it seems like people were still aware of how to dye the Techeiles, even though it will show that already it seems to have been becoming more rare. We get the idea that at the time of the Geonim, the period after the Gemara, that's when we sort of lost both the tradition for how to make Techeiles. We lost any remnants of Techeiles. We don't have the tradition. We don't know where it's found. And we'll see that it's during the time of the Geonim that we cease to have Techeiles, and it ceases to be part of the mitzvah. It just disappears, and we just don't have anymore. And then the story of Techeiles takes a huge, huge gap in the timeline. Since the time of the Geonim after the Gemara until the 1800s, very little happens in the world of Techeiles. And then comes along the Rabbi, Rabbi Gershon Henoch Leiner, the author of many works. He has a fascination with Techeiles, and he wants to reinvigorate it. And he wrote a whole bunch of svarim on it. He has on the called Ptil Techeiles, Einat Techeiles, Chol, a whole bunch of svarim. He wants to reinvigorate the mitzvah of Techeiles. He wants to find out what it is. And he does a whole bunch of research, and according to him, he posits that it's a crustacean called a cuttlefish. The problem is he doesn't know how to make dye from a cuttlefish. We know it has to be from a chilazon. The Gemara says that all Techeiles has to be from a chilazon, as we'll see. It's a type of a sea creature, but we don't know what it was. We lost that tradition during the time of the late Gemara, during the time of the Gaon, and we don't know what it is. He's trying to recreate it based on hints that we find in the Gemara, which we'll see shortly. And he suggests that it's a cuttlefish, but he doesn't know how to extract dye from this cuttlefish. It's not his specialty. He goes to Italy to try to find a chemist who can help him extract dye from the cuttlefish, And as we'll see, he suggests it needs to be a dark blue dye. And he finds a chemist who's able to do it. And he says, this is the Techeiles. And he then starts dipping his tzitzis in it. And for many years, the Radzina Hasidim wear his Techeiles. There was a lot of opposition to it back in the day, both based on hashkafic, halachic, and later some scientific challenges as well. It turns out that the Techeiles that was made for the Radzina Rebbe by this chemist in Italy, the blue was not actually an extract of the cuttlefish. What it was instead was, in order to turn the fish, to get the dye out, to get it onto the wool, a whole bunch of other chemicals need to be added and the process needs to be done. And it turns out that process was what made the tzitzis blue. It wasn't actually the fish. If you left the fish out, it would still turn blue. And therefore, many showed that this cannot be really what the Techeiles is, because even without the fish, it would be blue. And we know that it has to come from a fish. Here, the fish isn't necessary to the process. And a little bit later, in 1913, Rav Yitzchak Herzog, who will then become the chief rabbi of Israel, currently then he was the chief rabbi of Ireland, writes a PhD thesis. He calls it porphyrology, the study of argaman, of tchelet, of dyes that were used in the Mishkan and the Bigdei Kahuna. And he also is at a loss to try to figure out how exactly is he going to figure out how to get from the snail or the fish to the dye. And he suggests, in fact, that it might be the Murex trunculus. The Murex trunculus is a snail. He just doesn't know how to get it to be blue. And he suggests that that's potentially a problem because he knows it needs to be blue. And if it can't come from the snail, he doesn't know how to figure it out. It could be, but he can't make it happen. And only much later, in 1985, did Rav Eliyahu Tavger figure out the secret of how to do it. Because you see, historically speaking, this snail, this Murex trunculus, was used to make both purple and deep blue. And the challenge was that when anybody tried to do it in modern times, all they could get was purple. And they didn't understand, well, if it needs to be a blue. And so this seems to be an argument that the Murex trunculus could not be the snail from which Techeiles was made, because it doesn't make blue, until Rav Tavger figured out the secret to how it is, which we'll see in the chemistry section. So in terms of archaeology, how do we know what was this? This suggestion is currently that it should be the Murex trunculus snail. So what evidence is there historically and archaeologically to prove that it's true? So we know that Techeiles was used for many things in the rest of the world, aside from tzitzis and Bigdei Kahuna. The Ramban writes that this was what the royalty wore. It was something that was reserved for royalty. And he says, Kidmutam yilbashu hamalachim bizman haTorah. That's what they wore. And he even continues later and says, even nowadays, it's rare, and it's only found among the aristocracy. The Gemara seems to indicate that it was used for other things as well. And in fact, it suggests that if a person finds Techeiles on Shabbos, can they assume that it's made for tzitzis or not? But the assumption is, the Gemara in Eruvin assumes that Techeiles was used for other uses also, not just tzitzis, meaning that the dyeing industry was the common dyeing industry. That which was used for Techeiles, for the tzitzis, was also used for other types of garments. And so it should be the same process. It should be the same snail that was used for tzitzis was used for these other products, these other clothing. The Gemara in Eruvin wants to know different cloth that's found on Shabbos, what its status is, assuming that they're all done with the same, they look all identical, meaning that the tzitzis was used, the dye that was used, the snail that was used to produce the dye was the same all around. And it's interesting because the Gemara Menachos assumes that there's only two things that could possibly make that same color. It could be Techeiles or something called Kela Ilan. It either comes from the chilazon, from the snail that's used for the mitzvah of Techeiles, or something called Kela Ilan. Now, Kela Ilan, as we'll show a little bit later, is indigo. There's a lot of Rishonim, Geonim. The Aruch writes that Kela Ilan is indigo, and we're pretty sure we know what indigo is. It's something that's been used. It's a plant-based dye, which is common and easy to use. And the Gemara assumes here that if you find something of this color, it's either Techeiles or Kela Ilan. There are only two options for what this color could have come from. So it's either Techeiles or Kela Ilan. So if we find that they were using this color, it must have been either for produced by the chilazon for Techeiles or for Kela Ilan. And those are the only two options there are for producing this color that the Gemara is aware of. Where was it found? So Pasuk in Yechezkel points out that Techeiles v'argaman miyei Elisha, and the Targum explains Mimedinat Italia, which we know from secular sources is where a lot of dye production was used, particularly of this Murex trunculus snail. This pasuk embraces that Zvulun l'chof yamim yiskon v'u l'chof onyod v'yarcheto al tzidon. That Zvulun, which was heavily involved in the shipping and sailing industry, was on the coast in order to accomplish that, and from in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael until Sidon. And the Gemara in Shabbos points out that the same pasuk that we saw earlier of the Yogvim in pasuk in Yirmiyah, Elut Sayada Chilazon. So where did the Chilazon found? Misulamot Shel Tzur ve'ad Haifa, in this very area where Zevulun was found. And if you take a look at the map of Israel from Haifa until Tzur, so Haifa is on the bottom of the map, Tyre is Tzur on the top, and precisely those are the locations where we found archaeological evidence of Techeiles and of snail-produced dye industry, and particularly of the Murex trunculus snail. We've also found coins in those areas that depict the snail, the Murex snail, on them as well. If you take a look carefully, you could see the Murex snail on it. Now, you have to remember, this was a symbol of royalty. This wasn't something that was so common, and to wear the argaman, to wear the Techeiles, was something to be proud of, and they put it on their coins, and we found many of these coins in that area, and that is precisely the shape of the snail that was used. And we see from here that it was common. This was the commonly produced dye. The dye that was done for these purposes was from this snail. We see also in terms of the language that the term Techeiles is used as in Medrash and Esther Rabbah and in Medrash Hagadol in many Midrashim as porphyrin or porphyra, which is porpora, which is the language that in Latin and in Greek, which relates to this very snail. We see evidence in the Ra'aviyah. The Ra'aviyah says that he's talking about Techeiles in the Gemara in Brachos, and he says that the Techeiles is called porphyrin. We see in the Mekor Chaim, the Chavos Yair, he writes that it's from porphyr, and that's the same color. He says, both of Techeiles ain't no blue. He says it's a little bit different, interesting, but he still uses the same language to refer to Techeiles, and we know from all over the secular literature that porphyra or porphyr is referring to this Murex trunculus. We see also in Kabbalistic works, discussing other things also, where Techeiles is referred to as porphyra at the bottom, Kizen Nikra porphyra de Malka v'Nikra Beged Techeiles. Regardless of what that means in spiritual mystical terms, he's clearly using the word porphyra and Techeiles to mean similar things. And we know from secular sources that that's true. Also, we know from Pliny the Elder in natural history, he refers to porpora and these purples and blue dyes that come from the Murex trunculus. We know from Aristotle a number of places who refers to these sea creatures, the porphyra, the Murex snails, as the source of the blue and the purple. And in other languages, in Greek and in German, I'm going to trust them that that's accurate, or at least the Google translation was accurate, that these things mean porpora or porphyra, and they're also referring to this purple dye, the purple fish, the Murex fish. And so we know that the Chazal, when they refer to it, that's what they were referring to. The timing. So we know that Mar mimashche aiti tchelet b'shnei Rav Achai, that when Rav Achai, who's living towards the end of the Gemara period, someone brought Techeiles, and it was something to be noted. It wasn't something that was available. It was something that someone brought it, and the Gemara took a note to say, hey, this is something interesting. This is not something that was very well established then. The Gemara in Sanhedrin points out that zug bami rekes v'tafsu nesher uviyadam devarim hanasa beluz umayniu Techeiles. It was a miracle that these two Talmidei Chachamim came to visit Rava, also living towards the latter end of the Gemara period, and they came from Eretz Yisrael. Rashi writes on the bottom that Rekes is Tiveria. They were caught by the Persians, and they had Techeiles with them. And this is something that was unique. They had to bring it from Eretz Yisrael. It's something that was notable. It was not something that seems to be terribly common, although it seems that they were familiar with it even during the time of the later period of the Gemara. You know, from the Ramban, we know that many Rishonim point out that they no longer had Techeiles in the Middle Ages. The Ramban explicitly says that Mimosa Geonim, that already from the Geonim period, they no longer had Techeiles. It was towards the end of the Gemara they did, and already towards the Geonim period, they no longer did. And in secular sources, we see something similar as well. In the 12 Caesars about Nero, that they were going to punish people who were producing Techeiles for non-royal purposes. We know from Codex Theodosius, which is a rule promulgated in 427 CE, which is towards the latter end of the Gemara period, that people were not allowed to use the dye, the imperial purple or the blues, products of the Murex trunculus snail, to do regular, mundane, everyday things. It was only reserved for royalty. And we know in Codex Justinianus in 470, where, if you read the Latin carefully, referring both to the purpura and to the Murex, that producing it for a non-royal purpose was punishable by death. Which is kind of interesting because it helps explain why a mitzvah min HaTorah was somewhat lost. How else could, it's a mitzvah min HaTorah. It's shocking almost that it's something that we lost the Mesorah for, something that people may have given their lives for, but if there was a risk of death in doing these things, so it understandably fell away. When the Jewish population moved to Bavel and there was no longer a significant Jewish population in Eretz Yisrael, and producing it was on the pain of death, it's understandable on some level why it was lost. And the timeline, the secular timeline, corresponds very well with Chazal. We found wool-based and cloth-based Techeiles dyes from those periods, from early on, to show that this was being done, particularly in those locations, and that we know that it was around at that time, and we don't really find it much thereafter. So how does Techeiles work? The color scheme, how exactly does it make sense, and how does it work? So what's the chemistry behind it? So what's the color? So the color of Techeiles, as Rabbi Goldberg mentioned earlier, the Gemara in Sot, the Gemara in Chulin, Rabbi Meir Omer, Manishtana Techeiles Mikol Tzivonim. Why was Techeiles picked as unique? Techeiles reminds us of the sea reminds us of the sky reminds us of God's throne of glory. If I had to guess, then it sounds like we're talking about a type of a blue. It's true, the sky has a variety of hues and a variety of shades, but it's blue. The sea can have a variety of shades, it's reflecting the sky. This clearly seems to be blue. There are some who suggested that no, it means something else, but it would, to my mind, it would seem terribly misleading of Chazal to give us all of these analogies and say, hey, but it was red, or it was purple, or it was something else. If it's referring to the sky, it's referring to something that's blue. Now, the sky can change during the day, during the nighttime, as it gets evening. The colors do indeed change, but it's referring to blue. And so we mentioned earlier it needs to be a blue. And we pointed out earlier that there are two sources of this blue dye. The first was Techeiles from the Chilazon, and the second was Kela Ilan from indigo. And the Gemara of Mitzia says, Amarava lamali dekadav rachmani yitzias mitzrayim beribis yitzias mitzrayim gavitzitzus yitzias mitzrayim b'mishkolos. The Gemara points out that the Torah reminds us that we have to remember the Exodus from Egypt numerous times. One of them is by tzitzis. So why does it have to remind us by tzitzis? So he says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's as if the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling us, Ani ushevchanti b'mitzrayim ben tipa shel bechor latipa she'ena shel bechor. I am the one, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, who at Yitzias Mitzrayim was able to differentiate who was a firstborn and who wasn't during the plague of the firstborn. So too, I can tell the difference. Me, the last line, Shetola kela ilan bebigdo va'omer tcheilasu. Someone who dyes their tzitzis with kela ilan to produce the same color and says that it's Techeiles. Because the colors are so similar that you could fool somebody. The colors are so very similar that you can't tell the difference by looking. Indeed, Chazal have some interesting type of a test in order to, a bunch of chemicals put together in order to figure out how to differentiate the two from each other. Very hard to understand what that means. The Yavet says we have very difficult time understanding how these tests are used. But from a visual perspective, they look identical. And so clearly you could have, in theory, dyed your tzitzis with Kela Ilan and produced the same color. You wouldn't have fulfilled the mitzvah. And the Gemara here is saying that seemingly it was something that could have been done. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is clearly saying, no, that's wrong. You must use the chilazon. Now we know what Kela Ilan is. Kela Ilan is indigo. We know from the Aruch, we know from Sadiago, we know from tons of Rishonim that Kela Ilan is indigo. And we know exactly what indigo looks like. We know how to produce it. It comes from a plant and we know exactly what it is. Techeiles, therefore, should look very, very, very similar. And in fact, the dye produced by the Murex trunculus snail is exactly the same chemical composition as Kela Ilan. It's, as we'll see shortly. It's the same exact chemical, and therefore it looks exactly the same. The only difference is the source of the dye. Did it come from an indigo plant or did it come from a chilazon? And that makes all the difference when it comes to the mitzvah. In terms of the dyeing process, so we saw this Gemara Menachah before. Amar le Abayler of Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda hat chel tehechitz. What do you do? So how do you dye Techeiles? Because that's what we're going to need to know. What do you do to the snail to see, could it be a snail from which you can produce Techeiles? Amar le Maitinan dam chilazon. You have to bring the dam of the chilazon. And elsewhere, Tosfot points out that it's not actually the blood of the chilazon. It needs to be in a separate, it's not part of the circulatory system of the chilazon, it's a separate sac, which in the Murex Techeiles it indeed is. It's called the brachial gland. It's a separate gland that has this dye, visamanim, and some other chemicals, or aminan lubiyura, or martachinan lay, and you have to heat it up, vishakinan purta bebiata, and you have to test a little bit in an egg, vitaminan lahu, and you test it, biudra, vishadinan lelahu, biata, vikalinan leudra, you get rid of that and you use Techeiles for something else. And the Rambam writes, Keitzan Sovi Techeiles, when he summarizes this halacha, he says it's the normal way that we dye things. Kederech shatzabayim osim. It was the regular dyeing process. It was the regular process used to dye things. Now, the Gemara seems to indicate that Techeiles is a color that is very fast, meaning it doesn't come off easily. Which also means, if you think about it, it's very hard to get on. It doesn't dissolve easily in water. And so what you need to do first is it's called reduction, in order to get it to be dissolvable in water and stick to the dye, stick to the wool rather, and that's why we heat it up. And that the Gemara seems to be indicating there was a fermentation process that took place that they would use to reduce it. We can use chemicals nowadays. They would leave a little bit of the flesh of the snail in there with the bacteria on it, which would reduce the dye, and then it would be able to adhere to the wool. But this was the common way of dyeing. It's called the vat dyeing. And in fact, there was a show produced in England called The Worst Jobs in History, which actually tried to see, could you do this? The people from the Techeiles Association were in touch with them about, we understand that using our current methods, you could take this Murex trunculus chilazon and produce Techeiles from it. Were they able to do it given the technology and the science available back in the day? And they go through a whole episode here, and you unfortunately can't see you can't hear it, but they show, and you can watch it on YouTube, how you can actually produce it using only tools and chemicals that were available to Chazal. It still works. Now, from the dyeing perspective, and what was a challenge for Rav Herzog was, okay, we can't get it to be blue though. Throughout the generations, all they could do is get it to be purple. And it's sometimes called Tyrian purple. Tyrian from Tyre, from Tsur, Tyrian purple. So how do you get it to be blue? And this was a challenge that Rav Herzog said, it can't be the Murex trunculus because it doesn't turn blue. And so what Rav Eliyahu Tavger found out in 1985 was, it's true. There's a reduction reaction that has to happen in order to get the dye to stick to the wool. But then it can get oxidized. Then there can be a photoreaction that happens afterwards. When you expose the Techeiles to light right after it was reduced, the dibromo indigo goes away. The bromines release, and what's left is blue. And so when you're dyeing it, when you're producing the dye, it looks like this greenish, bluish, yellowish mix. It doesn't actually look blue at all. And this is perhaps what Chazal meant when they said you have to do a te'ima with an eggshell. So you take an eggshell because it doesn't look blue. They don't know what it's actually going to be because you have to expose it both to air and light. And so while it's in the liquid form, it doesn't look blue. And so they would take a little bit out in an eggshell and dip some wool into it and see, will it actually turn blue? Because you can't tell in the process, you can only tell from the final process. And this is the dibromo indigo molecule. This is what makes it look purple. And when it's exposed to air and light, the bromines, the two BRs on the edge, come off and it turns into a blue. And you see here as they're producing it, this is on the Techeiles website, that it's yellow in the beaker. Once they dip the wool into the beaker, it comes out, and in front of your eyes, it turns to blue. I've seen it. It's a fascinating thing to watch. It goes from yellow to blue, something you can't transmit exactly through Zoom. It's a very stinky process because the snails kind of smell. But you can watch it happen in front of your eyes to turn from yellow into blue. And it's for that reason that this snail is assumed to be, the Techeiles Association assumes, and many poskim assume that this snail is the one that produces the Techeiles. And in fact, there's a nice little kuntres called Levusha Aron by Rabbi Hellman, who points out that in order to assume that the Murex is not the Techeiles, a lot of things have to happen. And the reason that you'd have to assume that the Murex was around as something else. Something else was found exactly in those areas. Something else was referred to as purpura. Something else could produce such a strong dye. Something else was identical to Kela Ilan. Something else would only be able to be differentiated by a fading. Something else must be extracted while alive. We didn't mention it earlier. The Gemara points out in Shabbos that the snail, to be used for Techeiles, it's better to extract the dye while the snail is alive or right after it dies. Otherwise, it doesn't work as well, and that's true with the Murex trunculus. Is an enzyme in the brachial gland called purpurase that you need in order for the reaction to take place. And soon after the snail dies, that enzyme starts to degrade and isn't useful anymore. It only works immediately after it was killed. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And you'd have to assume that all of these things were true in order to assume that this was not the snail that was used for Techeiles. However, only the Murex has documentation, both in secular literature. We don't have any Masorah on anything else. We don't have any information on any of the others. And then Chazal never mentioned something else. Chazal mentioned two sources, this Chilazon or Kela Ilan, seemingly arguing that both the history, the archaeology, and the chemistry would all support suggesting that the Murex trunculus is the snail that was used for Techeiles in antiquity. So I'll pass the baton now over back to Rabbi Goldberg to transition to Rabbi Leibowitz.